The setting of a city on the Arno. In the 13th century, Florence was not yet the jewel of the Renaissance, nor the seat of a ducal dynasty. It was a restless city of stone bridges, narrow alleys, and clangorous workshops, rising from the fertile valley of the Arno River. Surrounded by gentle Tuscan hills and nourished by the trade routes that connected inland Italy with the ports of Pisa and Livorno, Florence was destined by geography to become a marketplace of ambition. At this time, Italy was not a nation, but a mosaic of fiercely independent city-states. Each had its own laws, militias, and mercantile ambitions. Venice ruled the seas. Genoa dominated the western Mediterranean. Milan governed the fertile Po Valley. Florence, lacking both a port and an army of conquest, turned inward, toward finance, manufacture, and the subtle art of negotiation. The 1200s were an age when gold and trust were beginning to shape power more decisively than swords. The Crusades had opened trade with the East, bringing spices, silks, and precious metals into Europe. Merchants needed credit to move these goods, and cities like Florence developed systems of banking, exchange, and accounting that were centuries ahead of their time. The transformation from commune to republic. Florence's population by the mid-13th century was estimated between 60,000 and 80,000, a remarkable figure for medieval Europe. The city had been a Roman settlement, later a feudal holding, but by 1200 it was governed as a commune, a self-administered urban state. Wealthy families and merchant guilds shared power in a fragile balance, alternating between collaboration and rivalry. The governing structure was evolving toward what would later be called the Florentine Republic, a form of representative government dominated by the merchant elite. Yet beneath its republican facade lay a city driven by private interest, kinship alliances, and the constant struggle between factions. The Guelphs, who favored papal authority, and the Ghibellines, who supported the imperial cause of the Holy Roman Empire. Wars between these factions periodically set Florence aflame, but even in turmoil, commerce never ceased. Merchants knew that wealth could survive politics if handled with prudence. This blend of civic strife and financial ingenuity would later shape the Medici's own strategies, ruling not by force, but by the careful alignment of loyalty, credit, and opportunity. Trade and industry, the lifeblood of the city. Florence's early economy was built upon wool. The city imported raw fleece from England and Flanders, processed it with dyes and finishes from the East, and exported fine textiles across Europe. By the late 13th century, nearly one-third of Florence's households were connected in some way to the Arte della Lana, the wool guild. Each stage of production, from carding and spinning to fulling and finishing, employed specialized craftsmen. These artisans worked in cramped workshops that lined the narrow streets of the old city. Water from the Arno powered fulling mills, while chemical dyes from Lucca and Pisa gave the fabrics their renowned brilliance. The guild system, or arti, was both an economic and political force. There were 7 major guilds, the Arti Maggiori, including bankers, judges, merchants, and physicians. Beneath them were the Arti Minori, the lesser trades, blacksmiths, butchers, bakers, and tanners. Together, these guilds formed the social skeleton of Florence. They regulated prices, labor conditions, and even the city's politics. Membership in a guild was the foundation of citizenship. To have a voice in government, a man had to belong to one of these arti. This arrangement created a unique meritocratic illusion. Wealth, not birth, seemed the path to influence. Yet, in practice, families like the Medici would soon prove that economic merit and hereditary control could coexist perfectly. The rise of the money changers. While the wool trade filled Florence's coffers with silver, it was banking that transformed it into a financial empire. The earliest Florentine bankers were money changers who set up stalls on the banco, the wooden benches of the market square. Their task was simple: to exchange coins of differing origins and purity. Yet from this modest craft emerged an understanding of interest, exchange rates, and letters of credit that would eventually underpin all of European commerce. By 1250, Florence had already produced its first great banking houses, the Bardi, Peruzzi, and Acciaioli families. These firms extended loans to monarchs and traders across the continent. Their clerks mastered the new art of double-entry bookkeeping, using ledgers that balanced debits and credits in precise Latin. This was not mere arithmetic, it was the architecture of trust. One of Florence's greatest innovations was the gold florin, first minted in 1252. Weighing 3.5 grams and marked with the image of St. John the Baptist, it became the most stable currency in Europe for nearly 2 centuries. The florin's consistency made it a universal unit of exchange, used from London to Constantinople. It allowed merchants to settle contracts, kings to pay debts, and bankers to profit from the invisible movement of wealth. Where land had once defined power, money now did, portable, discreet, and capable of crossing borders. Florence became a city whose fortunes depended not on conquest, but on calculation. Urban prosperity and the social order. The success of Florentine trade created a new urban aristocracy. These were not knights or barons, but merchants and bankers, men whose status came from ledgers rather than lineage. They built fortified tower houses in the city center, symbols of both pride and paranoia. Narrow windows, high walls, and private chapels revealed a society rich in capital, but poor in security. The city's wealth also brought visible inequality. For every prosperous merchant, dozens of laborers lived on the edge of hunger. Day-wage workers, apprentices, and widows filled the lower quarters. Yet Florence's poor were not voiceless. Their demands for fair wages and political rights would later erupt in revolts like the Ciompi uprising of 1378, an early echo of class struggle in a capitalist world. Above them stood the popolo grasso, the fat people, or wealthy citizens, who dominated guilds and councils. These men viewed the Republic as a mechanism to preserve their interests. They invested in civic works, bridges, cathedrals, hospitals, not merely out of piety, but as a public display of legitimacy. It was within this system that the Medici would later master the art of appearing as servants of the city while quietly directing its fate. Florence as a financial nerve center. By the close of the 13th century, Florence's economic web reached deep into Europe. Its bankers financed trade routes across the Mediterranean and provided credit to courts in England and France. The Peruzzi firm alone employed hundreds of agents, maintaining correspondence from London to Cyprus. Florence was a city of letters, not of literature, but of letters of exchange. The English crown, engaged in its wars with France, depended heavily on Florentine loans. When King Edward III defaulted in the 1340s, both the Bardi and Peruzzi banks collapsed. a financial catastrophe that shook Florence and demonstrated the risks of international credit. But even in failure, these events taught valuable lessons. Later houses like the Medici Bank would diversify investments, cultivate church relations, and avoid reckless exposure to royal debts. Florentine bankers also became adept at navigating the church's ban on usury. Since charging interest was officially sinful, they disguised it through complex instruments, currency exchange, partnership fees, or forward contracts. Thus, moral doctrine and economic necessity coexisted in a dance of quiet hypocrisy, one that shaped the financial ethics of all Europe. Commerce and civic identity. Florence's prosperity fostered an intense civic pride. The city's humble origins in the Mugello Valley. The story of the Medici begins not in the marble palaces of Florence, but among the gentle hills and olive groves of the Mugello Valley, north of the city. It was a land of small farms and quiet villages, an unlikely cradle for a dynasty that would one day rule both Florence and the church itself. In these rural communities, families survived by weaving, trading, and lending. The Medici name, derived from medico, meaning physician, suggests that their early ancestors were healers or apothecaries, men of modest education who treated both the sick and the poor. But in a world where money was the new medicine for every ailment, the Medici learned a different kind of healing, financial, not physical. By the 1200s, the Mugello was supplying Florence with wool and grain. Younger sons from its wealthier families migrated to the city to seek their fortunes, joining the guilds or apprenticing in trade. Among them were the first known Medici, Chiarissimo de' Medici, who appears in records around 1200, and his descendants, who began trading in textiles and lending small sums. They were not nobles, but shrewd and literate men, precisely the sort of minds Florence rewarded. The family enters Florence. By the early 14th century, the Medici had established themselves within the city's commercial network. They lived modestly, occupying houses near the Church of San Lorenzo, the same district that would later become their spiritual and political heart. At this stage, they were one family among dozens of upwardly mobile merchants. But Florence's volatile economy offered chances for rapid ascent and for ruin. When the great houses of Bardi and Peruzzi collapsed in the 1340s after England's default, the old order of Florentine finance fell with them. New bankers, cautious and disciplined, emerged to fill the void. It was in this atmosphere of cautious rebuilding that the Medici began their rise. One of the earliest to gain notice was Averardo di Bicci de' Medici, who engaged in money changing and small-scale banking. His son, Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, would transform these humble operations into a continental institution. Giovanni di Bicci, the founder of fortune. Born around 1360, Giovanni grew up during a time of both opportunity and anxiety. Florence was recovering from plague, political upheaval, and financial collapse. Yet its merchants were restless and inventive, and its government was increasingly stable under the dominance of the merchant class. Giovanni learned banking as an apprentice under the established firm of the Rome branch of the Vieri di Cambio. This experience was decisive. He observed firsthand how money flowed between cities, how merchants used letters of credit to avoid transporting coin, and how the church's financial dealings offered both risk and reward. When Vieri's firm dissolved, Giovanni took with him not wealth, but something far more valuable, a reputation for integrity. In an age when trust was the foundation of finance, reputation was currency itself. By 1397, Giovanni had founded his own firm, the Medici Bank, Banco de' Medici, with headquarters in Florence and a branch in Rome. From these twin centers of commerce and faith, he began building a network that would soon stretch across Europe. The Florentine art of banking. The genius of Giovanni's approach lay in simplicity. Where earlier bankers had speculated recklessly on royal debts, Giovanni pursued steady, diversified profit. He cultivated merchant clients, guild treasuries, and, above all, the church. The papacy, then divided by schism between Rome and Avignon, required trusted bankers to manage tithes, collect revenues, and fund crusades. Giovanni's branch in Rome became the official banker of the papal curia, a position of immense prestige. Through this relationship, the Medici gained not only wealth, but also influence in the very corridors of spiritual authority. The Medici Bank employed the latest financial innovations. Clerks recorded transactions in double-entry ledgers, balancing every debit with a corresponding credit. They managed bills of exchange, which allowed merchants to move money between cities without carrying coin. These practices were subtle forms of what we now call international finance. In an era when trade spanned from London to Constantinople, such instruments were indispensable. And in the meticulous handwriting of these ledgers, one can already sense the rhythm of modern capitalism. The florin and the flow of gold. The success of the Medici Bank was inseparable from Florence's most famous creation, the gold florin. Minted continuously since 1252, the florin represented stability in a world of fluctuating currencies. It carried on one side the lily of Florence, and on the other the image of St. John the Baptist, a blend of civic pride and sacred authority. Giovanni understood that trust in coin required trust in the city itself. He invested in public projects, supported charities, and maintained an image of moderation. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he avoided ostentatious wealth, preferring quiet competence to extravagance. His restraint built confidence among clients, and confidence was the lifeblood of credit. The Medici Bank soon expanded to Venice, Geneva, Bruges, and London, each branch semi-autonomous, managed by trusted partners who shared in profits. This decentralized system allowed flexibility, but it also required discipline and loyalty, virtues that Giovanni enforced through kinship and careful oversight. Florence's economic web. To understand Giovanni's brilliance, one must imagine Florence as a living organism, arteries of trade, veins of credit, and a beating heart of ambition. Gold flowed inward from the Papal States, silver outward toward the wool markets of Flanders, and spices, silks, and pigments passed through its counting houses like blood. Bankers such as the Medici did more than lend money. They shaped the rhythm of the city's life. They financed the import of English wool, the construction of cathedrals, and the private ventures of explorers. They were not merely financiers, they were the architects of Florence's destiny. Giovanni's prudence allowed his firm to survive crises that ruined competitors. He avoided the temptation to fund wars or monarchs, choosing instead to invest in trade and the papal accounts. By the time of his death in 1429, the Medici Bank had become the largest and most respected in Europe. The Medici family's social rise. As wealth grew, so too did the Medici's social standing. Yet Giovanni remained cautious in public image. He declined positions that would attract jealousy, preferring to influence politics discreetly. Still, Florence's republican system required participation, and in 1420 Giovanni accepted the office of Gonfaloniere of Justice, effectively the city's head magistrate. His term was short but symbolic. It marked the moment when the Medici shifted from mere merchants to political actors. Giovanni used his position not to dominate, but to mediate, to appear as a friend to all factions. In a city torn by rivalries between powerful families, moderation was a weapon more potent than armies. Giovanni's fortune, estimated at over 180,000 florins, was immense. Yet he distributed it generously. He funded the rebuilding of the Church of San Lorenzo, sponsored charitable institutions, and provided dowries for poor women. These gestures were not mere philanthropy. They were calculated investments in public goodwill. In Florence, wealth demanded justification. To appear greedy was to invite envy and political danger. The Medici learned early the art of making generosity a shield, a principle that would define their dynasty for centuries. A new kind of nobility. In Giovanni's time, Florence was ruled by a coalition of merchant families who prided themselves on their civic virtue. The traditional nobility, the feudal lords of the countryside, had long been excluded from government. To be noble in Florence meant to serve the city, to fund its buildings, to beautify its churches. Giovanni's success, therefore, humble origins in the Mugello Valley. The story of the Medici begins not in the marble palaces of Florence, but among the gentle hills and olive groves of the Mugello Valley, north of the city. It was a land of small farms and quiet villages, an unlikely cradle for a dynasty that would one day rule both Florence and the church itself. In these rural communities, families survived by weaving, trading, and lending. The Medici name, derived from medico, meaning physician, suggests that their early ancestors were healers or apothecaries, men of modest education who treated both the sick and the poor. But in a world where money was the new medicine for every ailment, the Medici learned a different kind of healing, financial, not physical. By the 1200s, the Mugello was supplying Florence with wool and grain. Younger sons from its wealthier families migrated to the city to seek their fortunes, joining the guilds or apprenticing in trade. Among them were the first known Medici, Chiarissimo de' Medici, who appears in records around 1200, and his descendants, who began trading in textiles and lending small sums. They were not nobles, but shrewd and literate men, precisely the sort of minds Florence rewarded. The family enters Florence. By the early 14th century, the Medici had established themselves within the city's commercial network. They lived modestly, occupying houses near the Church of San Lorenzo, the same district that would later become their spiritual and political heart. At this stage, they were one family among dozens of upwardly mobile merchants. But Florence's volatile economy offered chances for rapid ascent and for ruin. When the great houses of Bardi and Peruzzi collapsed in the 1340s after England's default, the old order of Florentine finance fell with them. New bankers, cautious and disciplined, emerged to fill the void. It was in this atmosphere of cautious rebuilding that the Medici began their rise. One of the earliest to gain notice was Averardo di Bicci de' Medici, who engaged in money changing and small-scale banking. His son, Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, would transform these humble operations into a continental institution. Giovanni de' Medici, the founder of fortune. Born around 1360, Giovanni grew up during a time of both opportunity and anxiety. Florence was recovering from plague, political upheaval, and financial collapse. Yet its merchants were restless and inventive, and its government was increasingly stable under the dominance of the merchant class. Giovanni learned banking as an apprentice under the established firm of the Rome branch of the Vieri di Cambio. This experience was decisive. He observed firsthand how money flowed between cities, how merchants used letters of credit to avoid transporting coin, and how the church's financial dealings offered both risk and reward. When Vieri's firm dissolved, Giovanni took with him not wealth, but something far more valuable, a reputation for integrity. In an age when trust was the foundation of finance, reputation was currency itself. By 1397, Giovanni had founded his own firm, the Medici Bank, Banco de' Medici, with headquarters in Florence and a branch in Rome. From these twin centers of commerce and faith, he began building a network that would soon stretch across Europe. The Florentine art of banking. The genius of Giovanni's approach lay in simplicity. Where earlier bankers had speculated recklessly on royal debts, Giovanni pursued steady, diversified profit. He cultivated merchant clients, guild treasuries, and, above all, the church. The papacy, then divided by schism between Rome and Avignon, required trusted bankers to manage tithes, collect revenues, and fund crusades. Giovanni's branch in Rome became the official banker of the papal curia, a position of immense prestige. Through this relationship, the Medici gained not only wealth, but also influence in the very corridors of spiritual authority. The Medici Bank employed the latest financial innovations. Clerks recorded transactions in double-entry ledgers, balancing every debit with a corresponding credit. They managed bills of exchange, which allowed merchants to move money between cities without carrying coin. These practices were subtle forms of what we now call international finance. In an era when trade spanned from London to Constantinople, such instruments were indispensable. And in the meticulous handwriting of these ledgers, one can already sense the rhythm of modern capitalism. The florin and the flow of gold. The success of the Medici Bank was inseparable from Florence's most famous creation, the gold florin. Minted continuously since 1252, the florin represented stability in a world of fluctuating currencies. It carried on one side the lily of Florence, and on the other the image of St. John the Baptist, a blend of civic pride and sacred authority. Giovanni understood that trust in coin required trust in the city itself. He invested in public projects, supported charities, and maintained an image of moderation. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he avoided ostentatious wealth, preferring quiet competence to extravagance. His restraint built confidence among clients, and confidence was the lifeblood of credit. The Medici Bank soon expanded to Venice, Geneva, Bruges, and London, each branch semi-autonomous, managed by trusted partners who shared in profits. This decentralized system allowed flexibility, but it also required discipline and loyalty, virtues that Giovanni enforced through kinship and careful oversight. Florence's economic web. To understand Giovanni's brilliance, one must imagine Florence as a living organism, arteries of trade, veins of credit, and a beating heart of ambition. Gold flowed inward from the Papal States, silver outward toward the wool markets of Flanders, and spices, silks, and pigments passed through its counting houses like blood. Bankers such as the Medici did more than lend money. They shaped the rhythm of the city's life. They financed the import of English wool, the construction of cathedrals, and the private ventures of explorers. They were not merely financiers, they were the architects of Florence's destiny. Giovanni's prudence allowed his firm to survive crises that ruined competitors. He avoided the temptation to fund wars or monarchs, choosing instead to invest in trade and the papal accounts. By the time of his death in 1429, the Medici Bank had become the largest and most respected in Europe. The Medici family's social rise. As wealth grew, so too did the Medici's social standing. Yet Giovanni remained cautious in public image. He declined positions that would attract jealousy, preferring to influence politics discreetly. Still, Florence's republican system required participation, and in 1420 Giovanni accepted the office of Gonfaloniere of Justice, effectively the city's head magistrate. His term was short, but symbolic. It marked the moment when the Medici shifted from mere merchants to political actors. Giovanni used his position not to dominate, but to mediate, to appear as a friend to all factions. In a city torn by rivalries between powerful families, moderation was a weapon more potent than armies. Giovanni's fortune, estimated at over 180,000 florins, was immense. Yet he distributed it generously. He funded the rebuilding of the Church of San Lorenzo, sponsored charitable institutions, and provided dowries for poor women. These gestures were not mere philanthropy, they were calculated investments in public goodwill. In Florence, wealth demanded justification. To appear greedy was to invite envy and political danger. The Medici learned early the art of making generosity a shield, a principle that would define their dynasty for centuries. A new kind of nobility. In Giovanni's time, Florence was ruled by a coalition of merchant families who prided themselves on their civic virtue. The traditional nobility, the feudal lords of the countryside, had long been excluded from government. To be noble in Florence meant to serve the city, to fund its buildings, to beautify its churches. Giovanni's success, therefore, in the early years of the 13th century Florence. In the early years of the 13th century, Florence was not yet the gleaming jewel of Renaissance Europe. It was a compact, walled commune resting in the fertile valley of the Arno River, its streets narrow and crowded, its citizens restless and ambitious. Yet within its stone walls lay the seeds of a transformation so profound that it would one day shape the destiny of Europe itself. The Florence of this period was a city emerging from medieval obscurity, poised between feudal tradition and mercantile innovation. The feudal lords who had once dominated the Tuscan countryside were gradually losing their grip, replaced by a rising class of merchants, bankers, and artisans. It was this shift from land-based power to money-based influence that would define Florence's economic and political character for centuries to come. A city between empires. Florence's geographical position made it uniquely suited to commerce. Nestled between the Apennine Mountains and the Tyrrhenian coast, it served as a crossroads between northern Europe and the Mediterranean world. To the north lay the markets of France and Flanders, hungry for the fine textiles of Italy. To the south and east lay Pisa, Genoa, and Venice, their ships carrying goods and gold from the Levant. Florence sat between these routes, a hub through which both goods and ideas would pass. During the 13th century, Italy was formally part of the Holy Roman Empire, yet in practice its cities operated as independent communes, self-governing entities with their own armies, laws, and rivalries. Florence was one such commune, and like many of its neighbors, Siena, Lucca, and Bologna, it was torn between two political factions: the Guelphs, who supported the papacy, and the Ghibellines, who favored imperial authority. These conflicts were not mere political abstractions. They were deeply tied to the city's economy. Merchant families, dependent on papal favor and trade routes through the papal states, tended to side with the Guelphs. Landed nobles, whose wealth was rooted in feudal privilege, often leaned toward the Ghibellines. As these factions fought for dominance, the structure of Florentine society was being rewritten. From feudal lords to merchant princes. By the mid-13th century, Florence had begun to assert itself as a commercial republic. The old nobility, the magnates, still owned towers and estates, but their power was waning. The popolo grasso, the fat people, a term for the wealthy merchant and professional class, were on the rise. They formed guilds, known as arti, which regulated trade, protected members, and wielded enormous political influence. There were 7 major guilds, the Arti Maggiori, which included the Arte di Calimala, cloth finishers and merchants in foreign cloth, the Arte della Lana, wool manufacturers, and the Arte del Cambio, money changers and bankers. Beneath them were the lesser guilds, the Arti Minori, representing smaller trades like shoemakers, bakers, and blacksmiths. The wool trade was the foundation upon which Florence's wealth was built. Raw wool arrived from England and Spain, was processed in Florentine workshops, dyed with colors from the East, and woven into luxurious textiles that fetched high prices across Europe. Thousands of workers labored in this industry, carders, dyers, weavers, yet the profits flowed upward, enriching a handful of merchant families who would later become the city's financial aristocracy. The birth of banking. Commerce, however, demanded more than workshops and merchants. It required a financial system capable of supporting long-distance trade. Here, Florence's genius for innovation revealed itself. Out of necessity, the Florentines became angers. They devised bills of exchange, cambii, that allowed merchants to transfer money without physically moving gold. A merchant could deposit funds in Florence, receive a bill, and redeem it in Bruges or London. This system reduced the risk of theft, enabled large-scale transactions, and laid the groundwork for international finance. By the late 1200s, Florentine bankers such as the Bardi, Peruzzi, and Acciaioli families had established branches across Europe. They financed kings, popes, and crusaders. The Florentine florin, a gold coin introduced in 1252, became one of the most trusted currencies of the medieval world. Its stability and purity symbolized Florence's reputation for financial integrity. When other currencies fluctuated, the florin held its value, stamped with the city's emblem, the lily of Florence, on one side and the figure of Saint John the Baptist on the other. Crisis and opportunity. Yet Florence's prosperity was not without peril. The same global reach that enriched the city also exposed it to risks beyond its borders. Wars, papal excommunications, and royal bankruptcies could devastate entire fortunes. In 1345, both the Bardi and Peruzzi banks collapsed after King Edward III of England defaulted on massive loans, used to fund his wars in France. The shock rippled through Florence, causing economic hardship and political upheaval. But this crisis also cleared the stage for new players, smaller, more adaptable banking families who learned from the mistakes of their predecessors. Among these were the Medici, an old but modest family from the Mugello region north of Florence. They had been minor members of the Wool Guild, but by the late 14th century, they would begin to climb the social ladder, guided by prudence, patience, and a remarkable sense for opportunity. Guilds and civic identity. The guilds were not merely economic institutions, they were the backbone of Florentine civic life. Each guild maintained its own patron saint, chapel, and charitable works. Membership conferred status and protection, but it also demanded participation in public life. The city's governing council, the Signoria, was drawn from the major guilds, ensuring that merchants and artisans held the reins of power rather than hereditary nobles. This civic structure fostered a sense of collective identity, rooted in work, discipline, and merit. A man's worth was measured not by his ancestry, but by his contribution to the city's prosperity. It was a meritocracy of a distinctly Florentine kind, competitive, ambitious, and often ruthless. This culture of disciplined enterprise created the perfect environment for the Medici. Their eventual rise would not have been possible in a feudal kingdom. Florence's social mobility, combined with its obsession for prestige and patronage, rewarded the cunning and the industrious, traits the Medici possessed in abundance. The church and money. Florence's relationship with the church was complex. On the one hand, the city was deeply religious, filled with monasteries, cathedrals, and charitable institutions. On the other, it was the banking capital of Christendom, and banking, at least in theory, violated the church's prohibition on usury. To reconcile faith with finance, Florentine bankers devised subtle mechanisms to disguise interest payments. Instead of charging explicit interest, they made profits through currency exchange fees and accounting devices. The moral tension between profit and piety shaped much of Florentine thought. It also gave rise to a new kind of religious patronage. Wealthy families donated to churches, commissioned altarpieces, and funded public works to atone for their commercial sins. This blend of guilt, faith, and ambition would later blossom into the artistic patronage of the Renaissance, a synthesis of commerce and culture that reached its peak under Medici rule. Urban expansion and the built environment. As wealth flowed into Florence, the city itself transformed. The old Roman walls were expanded, new bridges crossed the Arno, and towers rose from the skyline, symbols of both defense and status. The construction of the Catholic of Santa Maria del Fiore, begun in 1296, reflected Florence's growing confidence. Its massive dome would not be completed until the 15th century, but even in its early... Part 2. The early Medici and the birth of the bank. By the dawn of the 14th century, Florence was a city alive with contradictions. Its streets echoed with the rhythm of looms and the shouts of merchants. Yet beneath the clatter of daily life, deeper forces were stirring. Ambition, calculation, and the desire for lasting prestige. It was in this restless environment that the Medici family began their long ascent from provincial merchants to the rulers of Florence and ultimately patrons of an age. The Medici name had been known in Tuscany for generations, though not yet as a symbol of grandeur. Their origins were humble, rooted in the Mugello Valley, a fertile stretch of land north of Florence, dotted with olive groves, vineyards, and small farms. The family's earliest records date back to the 12th century, describing them as landowners of modest means, engaged in trade and agriculture. Their name, Medici, literally meaning physicians, suggests an ancestral link to the medical profession, though by the 1200s the family had turned firmly toward commerce. The Medici were not noble. They were practical, prudent, and above all, adaptable. These traits would serve them well in a city where survival depended less on bloodlines and more on one's ability to read the shifting currents of fortune. The foundations of a family. In medieval Florence, success rarely sprang from isolation. The Medici did not rise through solitary genius. They rose through kinship, marriage, and the careful weaving of alliances. Family in this world was not a sentimental unit. It was an economic organism. The fortunes of brothers, cousins, and in-laws were bound together in a network of trust and mutual obligation. The earliest Medici to make his mark in the city's civic records was Chiarissimo de' Medici, active around 1200. He and his descendants served in minor offices and guilds, slowly integrating into the fabric of Florentine society. They were part of the popolo, the merchant class that was beginning to eclipse the feudal aristocracy. Over the following century, the Medici diversified. Some continued to trade in wool and cloth, others in money and real estate. They were not yet among the great merchant dynasties, families like the Bardi or Peruzzi, but they were laying the foundations of something more enduring, a reputation for reliability, discretion, and quiet competence. The shattered giants. The collapse of the Bardi and Peruzzi banks in the 1340s reshaped Florence's financial world. Their failure was catastrophic. Edward III of England, having borrowed enormous sums to fund his wars in France, defaulted on his debts. The resulting crisis rippled across Europe, toppling fortunes and families alike. Yet in the ashes of these fallen titans lay new opportunities. The great banks had become bloated, entangled in royal politics and reckless speculation. Smaller, more cautious firms, run by families with a stronger sense of local loyalty and careful bookkeeping, could now emerge. Among these rising houses were the Medici. They had learned from the calamity of others. Where the Bardi had lent millions to kings, the Medici would lend to merchants, bishops, and local institutions. Their approach was methodical, almost conservative. But behind that conservatism was a keen awareness of timing, knowing when to risk and when to wait. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, the architect of fortune. The true founder of the Medici dynasty was Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, 1360 to 1429. Born in an era of turmoil, marked by plague, economic hardship, and the lingering aftershocks of war, Giovanni inherited neither great wealth nor noble title. What he did inherit was something subtler, a reputation for integrity and an instinct for opportunity. Giovanni entered the world of finance through the Arte del Cambio, the guild of money changers and bankers. In Florence, guild membership was essential. It provided legal standing and access to civic office. Giovanni's early work was with the Rome branch of the Veri di Cambio Bank, one of the city's more reputable institutions. There, he learned the intricacies of currency exchange, letters of credit, and the delicate balance between commerce and church. When the very bank dissolved, Giovanni used his savings and his experience to establish his own enterprise around 1397, a modest firm that would one day evolve into the Medici Bank, the most powerful financial institution in Europe. Giovanni's genius lay not in speculation, but in trust. In a world where many bankers risked fortunes on royal loans or military ventures, Giovanni built his business on reliability. He cultivated relationships with guilds, monasteries, and papal agents. His transactions were careful, his profits steady. Clients knew that the Medici would pay their debts, honor their contracts, and protect their interests. The papal connection. The turning point came when Giovanni secured the account of the papal curia, the central financial administration of the Catholic Church. This was no ordinary client. The papacy was the largest and most complex institution in Europe, collecting tithes from every corner of Christendom. Managing its finances meant access to enormous funds, political influence, and unparalleled prestige. At the time, the papal court was located not in Rome, but in Avignon, in southern France. Giovanni deftly navigated this arrangement, placing trusted agents in both cities. His bank handled papal transfers, facilitated indulgence payments, and managed contributions from bishops and monasteries. This relationship would later be deepened under Giovanni's son, Cosimo. But even in Giovanni's lifetime, it transformed the Medici from a respectable family into a dominant financial power. The Medici method. Unlike the sprawling banking houses of earlier generations, the Medici Bank operated as a network of semi-independent branches. Each branch, in Rome, Venice, Geneva, Bruges, or London, was managed by a partner who held a share of the profits. This system allowed for flexibility. Branches could adapt to local markets while remaining united under the Medici name. The headquarters in Florence, however, retained ultimate control. Major decisions, particularly those involving foreign currency or papal accounts, passed through Giovanni's personal oversight. Detailed ledgers recorded every transaction, and the family's correspondence, written in a ciphered blend of Tuscan and Latin, reveal a world of meticulous attention to detail. The Medici model was a balance between central control and local initiative, a precursor to modern corporate management. Florence under tension. Even as Giovanni built his financial empire, Florence itself remained a city of tension and volatility. The Republican government, dominated by guild representatives, was prone to factional disputes. The legacy of the Ciompi Revolt of 1378, when wool workers rose against their employers, lingered in the collective memory. Florence prided itself on liberty, yet its politics were anything tranquil. Behind the Republican facade, a handful of families, the Albizzi, the Strozzi, the Pazzi, and increasingly the Medici, maneuvered for influence. The Albizzi in particular controlled much of the city's government during Giovanni's lifetime. They were aristocratic, conservative, and suspicious of the Medici's growing wealth. Giovanni, ever cautious, avoided direct confrontation. He declined high office, preferring to act through subtle means, loans to allies, gifts to the church, and strategic marriages. His wife, Piccarda Bieri, came from a respectable Florentine family, cementing the Medici's place among the city's upper echelons. By the time of his death in 1429, Giovanni was one of the richest men in Florence. Yet his public demeanor remained modest. He dressed simply, spoke sparingly, and maintained an image of humility. In the words of contemporary chronicler Giovanni Cavalcanti, he enjoyed power without appearing to seek it. The moral philosophy of wealth. Giovanni's era was one in which the moral status of wealth was under scrutiny. The Church condemned avarice and youth. Part 3. Cosimo de' Medici and the Foundations of Power. When Giovanni de' Bicci de' Medici died in 1429, he left to his eldest son, Cosimo, not merely a fortune, but a philosophy of conduct. It was a philosophy of quiet power, the art of leading without appearing to rule, of influencing without commanding. Giovanni's life had taught that success in Florence did not depend solely on wealth, but on discretion, timing, and the subtle management of appearances. Cosimo de' Medici inherited this lesson, and he mastered it to perfection. In a city famous for its jealous defense of liberty, he would become its most influential citizen, the man whom contemporaries called Pater Patriae, the father of the fatherland, while never holding a royal title or permanent office. The man and his character. Cosimo was born in 1389 in a Florence still haunted by the memory of the Black Death and the turbulence of the late 14th century. From his youth, he absorbed the lessons of his father's world, the discipline of account books, the importance of reliability, the intricate dance of guild politics. Yet, where Giovanni was cautious and reserved, Cosimo possessed a broader vision. He combined the banker's patience with the statesman's ambition. Contemporary observers described him as tall, dignified, and somewhat austere, a man of few words, with a calm demeanor that concealed formidable intelligence. He rarely displayed anger, but he never forgot a slight. He could be generous, even magnanimous, but his generosity was always calculated to produce loyalty. Cosimo's education extended beyond arithmetic and commerce. Like many men of his generation, he was touched by the new humanist movement, which sought to revive the study of classical antiquity. He read Latin, admired Cicero and Seneca, and valued learning as a form of moral cultivation. This interest would later shape his patronage of artists and scholars, making him a bridge between medieval piety and Renaissance curiosity. The expansion of the Medici Bank. Under Cosimo's direction, the Medici Bank expanded far beyond what Giovanni had built. By the 1430s, it had become a vast network stretching across Europe, from Rome and Venice to Bruges, London, and Geneva. Each branch was a semi-autonomous partnership, sharing profits with the main house in Florence, but operating with considerable local freedom. The Medici handled not only private accounts, but also the finances of the papacy, the most lucrative and politically sensitive client imaginable. The bank managed papal revenues from tithes, indulgences, and annates, transferring funds across Europe for ecclesiastical purposes. Cosimo's relationship with the papacy gave him both immense wealth and political leverage. When rivals in Florence sought to undermine him, he could call upon friends in Rome. When the Pope needed funds, he turned to the Medici. Money became a means of diplomacy, and Cosimo wielded it with exquisite skill. The Medici Bank also pioneered new techniques of accounting and investment. Their double-entry ledgers allowed for precise monitoring of assets and liabilities, and their use of bills of exchange enabled vast sums to move invisibly across borders. Florence, through the Medici, had become the financial heart of Europe. Florence divided. But Florence itself was as fractious as ever.
Its republican government, nominally a democracy of guild representatives, was in reality dominated by a handful of wealthy families. Chief among these were the Albizzi, led by Rinaldo degli Albizzi, who regarded the Medici with growing suspicion. The Albizzi had ruled Florence for decades, maintaining a tight grip on the Signoria, the city's ruling council. They were patricians, conservative in temperament, and distrustful of Giovanni's more populist style. To them, the Medici were upstarts, men of commerce, not lineage. Rinaldo feared, rightly, that Cosimo's wealth and generosity were eroding his faction's power. Cosimo's strategy was subtle. He lent money to friends and potential allies, supported public works, and extended quiet patronage to artists and scholars. He did not need to command. He simply made it advantageous to agree with him. The Albizzi, mistaking moderation for weakness, resolved to strike first. Exile and triumph. In 1433, Rinaldo degli Albizzi orchestrated a coup. He accused Cosimo of plotting to overthrow the Republic, of amassing private power under the guise of philanthropy. The charges were political theater, but they succeeded. Cosimo was summoned to the Palazzo Vecchio, arrested and imprisoned in the tower of the Signoria. For 7 tense days, Florence teetered on the edge of civil war. Cosimo's supporters gathered quietly, while his enemies debated whether to execute him. Rinaldo favored death. Others hesitated. Cosimo, calm even in confinement, bribed his jailers, communicated with allies, and waited. Finally, a compromise was reached. Instead of execution, Cosimo was sentenced to exile, a punishment that, in Florence, often served as a temporary reshuffling of power rather than a permanent disgrace. He departed the city under guard, traveling first to Venice. There, in the relative safety of another republic, he continued his business affairs. The Medici Bank did not falter. Its branches continued to profit, and Cosimo's reputation for prudence and generosity spread even further. In exile, Cosimo demonstrated one of his defining traits: patience. He neither raged nor despaired. He observed, corresponded, and quietly waited. It did not take long. The Albizzi regime proved unpopular, arrogant, divisive, and incapable of managing Florence's finances. Within a year, the political wind shifted. The city, restless and resentful, recalled Cosimo. He returned to Florence in triumph in 1434, greeted by cheering crowds. Rinaldo degli Albizzi, in turn, was exiled. The balance of power had reversed completely. The quiet rule. Cosimo's return marked the beginning of what historians later called the Medici regime, though it would have seemed at the time more like a republic than a monarchy. There was no coronation, no formal office of ruler. Cosimo simply occupied the center of every decision. He controlled the Borsa, the lottery by which officials were supposedly chosen, ensuring that allies filled key positions. He financed public projects, subsidized dowries, and extended loans to struggling merchants. In doing so, he made the prosperity of Florence dependent upon his goodwill. Yet he always maintained the appearance of humility. He walked the streets unescorted, dressed plainly, and refused ostentatious titles. "I have never loved pomp," he once said, "nor sought more power than was necessary to protect my friends." This modesty was more than a personal trait. It was political armor. In a city allergic to tyranny, Cosimo ruled by consent, not compulsion. His enemies might grumble, but few dared oppose the man who could ruin or rescue them with a single entry in his ledgers. patronage and the arts. If money was Cosimo's instrument of power, culture was his language of immortality. He understood, perhaps instinctively, that art and architecture could legitimize rule as effectively as any law. He sponsored the construction of churches, monasteries, and libraries throughout Florence. The most famous of these was the San Lorenzo complex, designed by Filippo Brunelleschi, the architect of the great cathedral dome. Cosimo funded not only the reconstruction of the church, but also the adjacent Medici family chapel, a masterpiece of early Renaissance design. He also established the Medici Library, curated by the humanist scholar Niccolò de Niccoli, whose collection of Greek and Latin manuscripts formed the nucleus of one of Europe's greatest libraries. Through such acts, Cosimo transformed Florence into a living museum of classical learning and artistic innovation. Artists and thinkers flourished under his patronage. Donatello, Fra Angelico, and Michelozzo all benefited from Medici.
Part 4. Lorenzo the Magnificent and the Golden Age of Florence. In the autumn of 1469, Florence witnessed a quiet but momentous transition. Cosimo de' Medici's son, Piero, often called Piero the Gouty for the illness that tormented him, had died. His eldest son, Lorenzo, only 20 years old, now stood at the head of the most powerful family in Florence. No decree declared him ruler, no title was bestowed. Yet everyone understood that the city's fate rested in his hands. The young heir. Lorenzo de' Medici was born in 1449, into wealth, learning, and expectation. His grandfather, Cosimo, had ensured that the boy received a humanist education, befitting a prince in all but name. Tutors trained him in Greek, Latin, poetry, philosophy, and the arts of diplomacy. He studied the writings of Cicero and Livy, rode horses with the ease of a soldier, and debated with scholars at the family villa in Careggi. Those who met him as a youth remarked upon his extraordinary presence, not handsome in the conventional sense, but commanding. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a wide, expressive mouth and intense eyes that seemed to alternate between irony and kindness. His charm was immense, his wit legendary, and his judgment precocious. Cosimo, seeing in him both intelligence and daring, reportedly said before his death, "This one will be the ruler of our house, but may God grant that he rule wisely." A city of contradictions. By the time Lorenzo came of age, Florence was a paradox, both free and ruled, proud and anxious. The city prided itself on republican liberty, yet in practice it followed the will of the Medici. Its merchants traded across Europe, yet political conspiracies still brewed in candle-lit chambers. Florence in the late 15th century was also a crucible of creativity. Painters, sculptors, architects, and philosophers all found in the Medici circle both patronage and inspiration. The air seemed charged with a sense of destiny, as if this small Tuscan city, hemmed in by rival states, had become the stage on which the human spirit itself was being reborn. Into this glittering yet dangerous world Lorenzo stepped, not as a conqueror, but as a conductor, orchestrating the energies of his city toward brilliance and balance. The first years of power. Lorenzo's early years in power tested his tact and courage. Many in Florence resented the concentration of Medici influence. Rival families, the Pazzi, the Soderini, and others, watched for weakness. Outside the city, enemies circled: the King of Naples, the Duke of Milan, the Papal States,
each eager to draw Florence into their orbit. Lorenzo's strategy was to govern through grace. He appeared in public often, attended festivals, presided over poetic contests, and opened his palaces to artists and scholars. His demeanor was relaxed, approachable, even playful, yet behind that charm lay meticulous calculation. He reinforced Medici power by securing control of key appointments in the Signoria, by funding civic works, and by marrying advantageously. His union with Clarice Orsini, a noblewoman from Rome, strengthened ties with one of Italy's most aristocratic families, a shrewd gesture toward legitimacy beyond Florence's walls. At the same time, Lorenzo cultivated the people's affection through magnificence. He sponsored tournaments, pageants, and public celebrations that dazzled citizens and visitors alike. He wrote poetry, composed songs, and even performed in masques. Florence adored him, not merely as a politician, but as a symbol of his own vitality. The patron of the Renaissance. Under Lorenzo, the Medici household became the beating heart of the Renaissance. His patronage extended to a constellation of geniuses whose works would define Western art. In painting, he supported Sandro Botticelli, whose Birth of Venus and Primavera transformed myth into poetry. In sculpture, he encouraged a young Michelangelo Buonarroti, who grew up under Medici protection and first studied in the gardens of San Marco, where ancient statues and modern talent met. In architecture, he consulted with Giuliano da San Gallo and others to renew Florence's churches and palaces in harmonious proportion. But Lorenzo's interest went beyond the visual arts. He was a true Renaissance humanist, fascinated by philosophy, literature, and the recovery of classical wisdom. He gathered around him thinkers such as Marsilio Ficino, translator of Plato, and Pico della Mirandola, whose oration on the dignity of man proclaimed humanity as divine in potential. At the Medici villa in Careggi, Ficino's Platonic Academy met beneath frescoed ceilings and cypress trees, reading Plato not as a relic, but as a living guide to virtue. There, amid conversation and song, they imagined a synthesis of pagan philosophy and Christian faith, a vision of man as both earthly and celestial, finite yet aspiring to the infinite. It was a dream uniquely suited to Florence, a city ruled not by arms, but by intellect and art. The Pazzi conspiracy. Yet not all shared Lorenzo's vision. Among the noble families who chafed under Medici dominance were the Pazzi, ancient rivals in commerce and pride. In the late 1470s, their resentment found a dangerous ally in Pope Sixtus IV, whose nephew had been denied a Medici-backed position in Florence. A plot took shape, one that would shake the city to its core. On April 26, 1478, during High Mass in the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, the conspirators struck. As the choir sang, daggers flashed. Lorenzo's brother, Giuliano de' Medici, was stabbed to death, 19 wounds, before the high altar. Lorenzo himself was wounded in the neck, but managed to escape into the sacristy, barricading the doors as chaos erupted. The attack failed to kill him, but it ignited Florence's fury. Within hours, the conspirators were hunted down and executed, some hanged from the windows of the Palazzo Vecchio. The city rose as one, rallying not for the Republic, but for Lorenzo. The Pazzi conspiracy marked a turning point. In surviving it, Lorenzo became more than a merchant prince. He became the unchallenged ruler of Florence, revered as the man who had preserved the city's life at the cost of his brothers. But the vengeance of Rome was swift. Pope Sixtus excommunicated Lorenzo and placed Florence under interdict. Allied with the King of Naples, the papacy declared war. Lorenzo's diplomacy. The conflict that followed could have destroyed Florence. Yet Lorenzo's greatest strength was not the sword, but the spoken word. In 1479, he undertook a daring journey, traveling alone and unarmed to Naples to meet King Ferrante, one of Italy's most feared rulers. Many believed he would be imprisoned or killed. Instead, Lorenzo charmed the king, appealed to his sense of honor, and negotiated peace on equal terms. This mission secured not only Florence's safety, but also Lorenzo's legend. He returned to the city in triumph, hailed as the savior of the Republic. His diplomacy became the model for the delicate balance of power that would later define the Italian state system. From then on, Florence enjoyed a rare stability. Trade flourished, the arts blossomed, and the Medici name carried weight from Venice to Paris. The magnificent court. In the years that followed, Lorenzo presided over a court that blended refinement with intellectual freedom. He corresponded with princes and poets, welcomed scholars fleeing the fall of Constantinople, and collected manuscripts that would form the nucleus of the Laurentian Library, still one of the treasures of human civilization. He himself wrote extensively, love sonnets, religious hymns, and political reflections. His verses combined elegance with melancholy, the voice of a man aware of the fragility of fortune. He delighted in festivals, in laughter, in the fleeting beauty of music and color. Yet behind his genial exterior lay a deep sense of responsibility.
Part V. Exile, Return, and the Age of Machiavelli. When Lorenzo the Magnificent died in 1492, the city of Florence stood at a crossroads. For half a century, the Medici had been the invisible rulers of the Republic, guiding its councils, financing its art, and steering its destiny through subtle mastery. But beneath the harmony Lorenzo had maintained, cracks were already forming. His son and successor, Piero di Lorenzo de' Medici, known to history as Piero the Unfortunate, inherited not his father's wisdom, but only his burdens. Piero the Unfortunate. Piero was 21 when he assumed control of Florence. Handsome, athletic, and proud, he lacked the tact, intellect, and restraint that had defined his father and grandfather. He approached government with the arrogance of entitlement rather than the delicacy of persuasion. The intricate web of alliances Lorenzo had built with Milan, Naples, and the papacy required constant care. Piero neglected it. Then came the storm. In 1494, Charles VIII of France crossed the Alps with a massive army, claiming the throne of Naples and demanding passage through Tuscany. Italy, fractured and unprepared, trembled before this new power. Florence, strategically placed on the French route, became a pawn in the great game of kings. Piero, panicked and inexperienced, attempted to negotiate. He rode to meet Charles, but instead of bargaining with firmness, he capitulated. He surrendered Florentine fortresses, Pisa, Livorno, Sarzana, without resistance. When news of this humiliation reached Florence, outrage exploded. Crowds filled the streets shouting, "Down with the Medici!" The same people who had once adored Lorenzo now turned upon his son. On November 9, 1494, the gates of the Palazzo Medici were stormed.
The family fled, their wealth plundered, their palace ransacked. The Medici, after nearly a century of dominance, were exiled once more. The Republic restored. With the Medici gone, Florence proclaimed the return of the Republic. But liberty, as always, was easier to declare than to sustain. In the vacuum of power rose a voice both mesmerizing and terrible, the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola had first come to Florence during Lorenzo's time, preaching against corruption, vanity, and the moral decay of Italy. Few had heeded him then. Now, in the chaos following the French invasion, his words fell like thunder. He declared that Florence was chosen by God to be a new Jerusalem, pure, humble, and righteous. He condemned luxury, denounced tyranny, and called for repentance. His sermons filled the cathedral to overflowing. The people wept, trembled, and believed. Savonarola's influence soon transcended the pulpit. He became the spiritual dictator of Florence, guiding its councils through fear and ecstasy. Under his rule, gambling and dancing were banned. Books deemed immoral were burned. Women were urged to renounce adornment. On the Piazza della Signora, citizens built the infamous Bonfire of the Vanities, consuming mirrors, paintings, jewelry, even manuscripts in the flames of purification. For a time, Florence seemed to live under a spell, part devotion, part delirium. The fall of the prophet. But Savonarola's reign, like all reigns of zeal, could not last. His enemies multiplied. The worldly clergy, the merchants whose wealth he condemned, the humanists whose art he censored, and the papacy itself. Pope Alexander VI, outraged by his defiance, excommunicated him in 1497. The friars' grip on Florence began to falter. Famine struck, trade collapsed, despair set in. On May 23, 1498, Savonarola was seized by his enemies, tortured, and condemned as a heretic. He was hanged and burned in the same square where his bonfires had once blazed. As the smoke cleared, Florence stood once more adrift, its prophet dead, its faith shaken, its future uncertain. The rise of the secretary, Machiavelli. In the turbulent years that followed, the Florentine Republic sought stability. Its government was reorganized with councils modeled on Venetian institutions, a balance of democracy and oligarchy. Among the new officials was a young civil servant whose keen mind and ironic wit would make him immortal, Niccolò Machiavelli. Appointed secretary to the second chancellor, Machiavelli became the Republic's chief diplomat. He traveled to courts and camps across Italy, to the French king, to Cesare Borgia, to the papacy, observing the machinery of power with a detached and penetrating gaze. In his letters and later writings, Machiavelli revealed a mind both realist and tragic. He admired strength, cunning, and decisiveness, virtues he believed Florence lacked. He saw that morality alone could not preserve a state. What was needed was virtù, the disciplined energy to shape fortune. As Florence struggled to defend its independence against foreign armies and internal division, Machiavelli's thought matured into a new vision of politics, one that saw power as art, not sermon. Return of the Medici. Yet while Machiavelli served the Republic, the exiled Medici never ceased plotting their return. They moved between Rome, Venice, and Bologna, cultivating allies and waiting for opportunity. That opportunity came in 1512, amid the shifting alliances of the Italian wars. The papacy, now under Pope Julius II, sought to restore friendly governments across Italy. The Medici, aided by Spanish troops, marched on Florence. After brief resistance, the Republican army collapsed. On September 1, 1512, the Medici re-entered the city in triumph. Bells rang, banners waved, and the people, weary of turmoil, offered little protest. Among those returning was Giovanni de' Medici, son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who would soon ascend the papal throne as Pope Leo X. Machiavelli's fall. For Machiavelli, the restoration of the Medici meant ruin. As a known Republican official, he was arrested, accused of conspiracy, and tortured. He was released only after weeks of imprisonment, but his career was finished. Retiring to his small estate outside Florence, he turned his mind to reflection and writing. There, in solitude and disgrace, he composed The Prince, a work dedicated, ironically, to the Medici who had destroyed him. In that slender book, Machiavelli distilled the lessons of a lifetime, that states are not preserved by virtue alone, but by prudence, force, and the intelligent use of fear. His cold-eyed analysis of power would scandalize generations. Yet beneath its realism lay the wounded heart of a patriot who longed for Italy's unity and Florence's freedom. Leo X, the Papal Medici. When Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X in 1513, the Medici reached the summit of worldly glory. From banker's son to pontiff, the arc of their ascent was complete. Leo X's papacy was a festival of opulence. Educated in the humanist circle of his father Lorenzo, Leo adored art, theater, and ceremony. He summoned Raphael, Michelangelo, and Bramante to adorn Rome with splendor unmatched since antiquity. The Vatican became a palace of light and music, its corridors filled with laughter, poets, and scholars. Yet beneath this magnificence stirred the beginnings of a storm, one that neither Leo nor his advisors could foresee. In 1517,